know of it when you respond to our survey, letting us know what you liked about the K-Club, what you didn't like, as well as topics that you'd like us to either repeat or cover in future sessions. So to encourage you to do so, we are giving away each month a limited edition K-Club mug. And so all the people who responded to the survey last month, I am going to award this to Chanta Whitlow. Oh, excellent. Feedback. Carry this out. Okay. Also, I wanted to put a plug in for Research Resources 101 that's later this month, and it's going to be on the NIH rigor and reproducibility requirement. One of our panelists today, actually Gary Miller, will be presenting at that. He has become sort of the resident expert on these new requirements and just basically doing good science and talking about the ways that you need to address this in the new application. So I encourage you to come for that. We are planning to do a K-Club on the same topic, and we'll probably do some repeating, but put a slightly different spin on it, so I encourage you to come to that as well. I wanted to give a special thanks to our K-Club sponsors. As you know, for the past couple of years, it's been the Emory Children's Pediatric Research Center, Department of Medicine, and AXI has kindly sponsored this program, and recently CFAR has become one of our co-sponsors as well, so we appreciate their support. And just briefly today, some of the Biosketch examples that I'll be showing you are from Gary Miller, Paul Spearman, and Sue Abdeline, who is professor at Tulane. So why are we here today? So how many of you came to the session last year when we talked about the new Biosketch? Okay, not that many of you actually. Okay, so flashback to last year, and what was the scientific community's reaction to these new Biosketch changes? It was really an overhaul of how it had looked before and what they were going to take effect in May of 2015. So overall, it was really, really negative. The scientific community said, why do we need to change it? It's creating so much more work. It was quite a bloodbath, if I may say. There was one somewhat positive comment that this person made. As a science fiction writer and grant writer, this new NIH Biosketch format should generate lots of new business for me because I specialize in the section that nobody wants to write and fewer folks want to review. So we'll see. What's the reality check? What is the consensus? How do people like it? So on the good side, I will say that overall, in my experience and some reading that I did on some blogs ahead of this session, I think that applicants rather like it. Once you dig in and do it, it gives you new ways, especially junior investigators, because you really can frame your research, provide a stronger overall rationale and direction of the career work to really strengthen your application. So these are real comments that I got offline off of drugmonkey.org. This other person said it gives me the chance to explain some of the collaborative publications that they were involved in clinical research where they weren't first authors, but it gave them a real bona fide opportunity to explain that they were a big part of it and explain their role in that. And one person said that they used it as a chance to brag that one of their papers had been cited almost 400 times, and they actually admitted, I'm not sure if mentioning this is a good idea or not. And so that's a question that we'll have for our panelists later on, if that would be reviewed as obnoxious or helpful. Somebody who's a part of our system, a new investigator who I was working with recently, mentioned that he had a lot of publications but hadn't had prior funding, but he felt like the new format really helped him out a lot because it allowed him to group his publications under this common theme or umbrella and to sell his work as more of an impressive, complete body rather than just these single publications in isolation. And he's also able, and this is, I think, important, to highlight specific publications that were in line with the grant application RFA. You can strategically switch out the different publications and contributions you cite to be in line with that. It's great that the applicants like it, but what do the reviewers think? So far, looking at some of the same comments that were on the drugsmonkey.org website and in talking to reviewers, I think tolerating may be a good word. One person said that it hinders their evaluation and they ended up having to spend more time because they had to look at the PubMed link or the link that was provided and look through the publications and really draw their own conclusions. And oh, by the way, they mentioned that only, at least at that time, only 50% of the applicants included that since it is optional. Somebody said, no reviewers are going to do anything more than superficially skim this gibberish. It is much more useful to go to PubMed and view the real chronological arc of the PI scientific contributions. So early on, the reviewers were saying, at least on this blog, that they felt like they could just do a better job themselves. Today, the panelists that we have before us are all NIH-funded investigators who have served as reviewers, and they're going to give us their input on, and strategically along this path about what they think will help and how you can best position your research. So just first, I'm going to take a few minutes at the beginning here to make sure we're on the same page about what a Biosketch is, what the different sections are, so that when they speak to that, you'll really have a perspective on what exactly we're talking about. And here probably knows that the NIH is this really highly formatted, very specific instructions, 5 pieces of paper that highlight the qualifications of the PI and also the other key personnel that are on a grant application. This next slide shows the general outline. Everything in red is what was new last year. So you've got 4 different sections. The personal statement's been there for a number of years, but last year there was an allowance of adding citations, which is an honor that's always been there. This contribution to science was the biggest change last year. It was a brand new section where you could really frame out your publication, categorize them, and talk about what you've done. So one thing to keep in mind as we go through this, when we're talking about the personal statement, that's about yourself. That's your journey. That's what brought you to where you are today and where you want to go. And your contribution to science is about your research and your role in that research. So that's something kind of to anchor you as we go through this. So what was new last year, it was extended from 4 to 5 pages. You could list publications in both the personal statement and contribution to science section. Those contributions to science, you could list up to 5. There's also the option to include the full list of published work and a tool to help build the new Biosketch, which I'm going to mention. We have an impact session today. If we have time at the end, we'll touch upon that. But if we don't, you can contact me after and we can talk about that. You may have seen that not yet 1 year into this, NIH is already fine-tuning these instructions, and so they're already changing them. So what's new is the URL for the publication list is still optional, but if you do it, you can't do it via Google Scholar or anything like that. It has to be a .gov tool, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. They do allow publications and research products. I think that's a really big deal because it can be websites, it can be abstracts, it can be patents. So that in it was sort of allowed in the contribution to science section before, but now they allow it everywhere. One thing that was very controversial last year in our session was the fact that they had allowed graphics, figures, and tables as sort of citations, which I think our panel thought was a bad idea. And so not too surprisingly, they've now disallowed that. So that no longer is allowed in the Biosketch. The option to add other names, which basically, if you have a name change, you can say it, which people have done, but now it's official. Research products, specific what's allowed there, and I'm very anxious to get our panel's impressions on what is really impressive and maybe just fluff. And they do say, however, and I think this is really important because a lot of times people want to put their manuscripts in prep, but manuscripts that are submitted are still not allowed, which I think is a good thing. Because really, it just says that you've got a lot in the burner, but nothing really that's been published. So I think proceedings and things like that are allowed, but manuscripts are not. So as we go through this, I think it's really important to know and recognize that as you're writing your Biosketch, your audience is the reviewer. Hence the reason we put this panel together today. You want to use your Biosketch strategically to lead your reviewer through your career, spoon feed them so they can understand who you are, what makes you tick, what you're capable of accomplishing. You want to put in context what you've already accomplished and how that perfectly positions you to lead the proposed aim in this application. So you'll speak to the type of application. Very junior investigator putting in for an R, that's going to take a little bit of explaining of why you're ready to do that. Or if you're already quite accomplished and you're going for a K, likewise, you really are going to have to spell out what's your hook, what more do you need, why are you not going for that R. I think it's always good for you now that the reviewer is going to know the best predictor of your future behavior is your past behavior. If you're putting in an application where you don't have any publications, the onus is on you to really explain how, now that you're embarking on this research, how you actually are going to have these goals. Center for Scientific Review has specific advice to applicants on the NIH Biosketch, which I've put up here. I think that certainly not rocket science or anything like that, but I think that they try to, the last bullet there, they tried to tell you to relax. Since you are a new investigator, this is something that can help you. Because if you don't have a ton of publications, it allows you to the publications you do have is maybe middle author, you can put in a framework of how you actually were an important person in that research process. The reviewers also get guidance from Center for Scientific Review. They are told to take the time to read the biosketches. That could save time in assessing their contributions. And they are also told that they may factor uninformative biosketch into their scoring if it hinders their ability to assess the investigator. So I don't know about you, but I'm very interested to hear if that actually does happen. And so when we get to those sections, we'll specifically ask them the question if they have examples, if it has hindered a review and maybe given an applicant a lower score. Now that we've covered that background, I just want to briefly into what the anatomy of the personal statement. So remember, that is what's about instructions from the NIH on the personal statement. To briefly describe why you are well suited for the role in the project, including your training, your previous experimental work, your technical expertise, your collaborators, and past performance. And if this is new, you may set up to 4 publications or research products that highlight your experience. Just the definition of a research product, much anything you can imagine. So they've really expanded the net to allow you to put in anything that's related to research. So audio, video, databases, educational aids, protocol, software, netware. So really casting a wide net with that. For the personal statement, the following additional instructions are submitted now for biosketches that are going to be included in applications due next month on May 25th. This first one, I think is a little bit odd, but it's for K awards, grant applications with faculty who are not listed as key personnel are encouraged to complete this section but are not required to do so. I'm not really sure where that's coming from, but that is one of the new pieces of instruction. Again, if you've been married, you can, or divorced, or changed your name for whatever reason, you can specifically cite that. That you can mention contributions to science that aren't included in the other section, but they really don't want you to have a lot of duplication between the personal statement and contributions. And again, figures, tables, and graphics are no longer allowed. Just a reminder, when thinking about putting together your personal statement, it shouldn't be too long, half page to 1 page max. We're going to customize this for each section so that it speaks to the grant proposal. And I know the panelists are going to talk a little bit about not only making sure your biosketch is customized for the application, but everyone on your whole research team. You want to be accessible, writing in the first person, and being aspirational. And if you do have impediments in your career, you can mention them here. So this is an excerpt from Sue Ellen Abdeline, who's from, as I mentioned, from Tulane, and she's a professor. I had the pleasure of working with her on a recent grant application, and I just loved her biosketch so much I had to ask her if I could use this excerpt. Now, not many of us have been through a catastrophic event like Hurricane Katrina, but she had, and I just thought she did such a wonderful job putting it in the context of how it helped her in her research career. It shows her perseverance and her ability to pull together in this difficult time and still accomplish her research aims. So just briefly, she talks about how she's assembled her research team and how she was being successful in this endeavor. This is evident when the work was punctuated by a hurricane disaster that emptied the entire city So every single clinical site, community agency, charity hospital, two-lane hospital, displaced all our community for months to years while also creating widespread homelessness. Research staff and I worked tirelessly to retain integrity in the face of personal disaster and loss, to close studies, and then to rebuild clinical sites. Help rebuild the community of youth-serving agencies while newly recreating an active research site. I mean, to me, I got chills when I read it. But I think it shows that she's a leader of a team. She pulls people together, and she doesn't run from disaster. She's a strong advocate of that, which does kill you makes you stronger, which I think is a good quality to have for someone in research. This is another excerpt, and I apologize, Dr. Miller, because this is from last year. I'm sure this has been through many, many cycles. But I wanted to highlight this one because I saw this excerpt because it talks about something a little bit different in a very high-level sort of way. And specifically, he, at the time, used this creative liberty to talk about maintaining the website for the Human Exposome Project. Not to say that he's a forerunner in this, because now they specifically allow this kind of reference in the personal statement. But you probably were not chastised in any way the fact that you used it before, even when it was disallowed.
No, but it was in the personal statement part, where they kind of said you didn't have to have full publication. And so
I thought it was the opposite, that you could use non-publication and contribution, but no, to have that mixed up. Anyway, now it's a lot of both.
There's so many versions
now. I know. I think that this is another great example of really just in a sort of high-level speaking in an inspirational way about the things that he's done. So with that, with sort of this overview of the personal statement, we'd love to get questions from the audience. I have some questions up here, but right off the bat, I'm really just curious to know from if you wouldn't mind speaking if you have, from your review sessions, experienced investigators who get lower scores because of probably flaws in their biosketches or any sort of thing like that.
You want to just go down the line? Sure.
So I'm Russ Price, and the sections that two sections that I've been on so far that have used this, I think the thing that I would say about the personal statement that has gotten people into trouble would be people would talk about their personal statement, but they wouldn't relate were going to contribute to the particular project that was being reviewed. So a lot of times I like to know what the relationship is between the collaborator, the co-investigator, and the PI. And more times than I would like to think about, people ignore that piece, that's the knowledge. And so I would specifically ding somebody for that, no, but it sort of raised a question in my mind about whether they need to be on the grant.
what I see is more of like an integrity issue, is that I do, anytime you're reviewing a grant, is a trust but verify. So if someone says they've done all these great things, I'm still going to go look on PubMed and say, does it follow that? And if Biosketch gave me that context to understand it, that's great. But if it seems like they're saying much more in their Biosketch narrative than's actually resulted in papers, then I'm questioning their honesty and things. When it can be the opposite way too. Someone may undersell their achievements, but I think that I don't try to read too much in that personal statement. It's more of is there an issue that they're helping me understand that I wanted to understand? Like, for example, if there was a gap in publications, but they had some residency training or some family emergency or something, that's helpful to have. But I still very much do my own looking on Scholar and PubMed. You can't fake it, is what I think part of it is. Make sure it's consistent with actually what the investigators can look at on their own.
So, I think many times people don't really talk about their gaps and why gaps and what's happening, nor do they talk about why they made a sudden right turn in search. And the context for why we're studying X, Y, Z, and suddenly they've gone over here and studying this. And so they don't spend the time to talk about their story, how did you get here, and how is this related, and how did that past training to where they are now in the direction they're headed.
What would you give as a legitimate reason for that? Because that's the other thing I think people worry is they'll be judged.
There to recognize you have a blank spot and you made a right turn. Don't ignore it. It's at your own peril.
So Paul Spearman, I think I've been on 4 study sections since this came out, and so I've read a lot of biosketches during that time. I'm still old-fashioned. I like the old one much better. It was shorter. It was more to the point. So I still look for the common things. What I try to get from a biosketch, and I always read them, I never skip them, it's probably the second most important part of the third maybe, specific aims, and then research plan, and then sketch, because you want to know who is the person. You know, I try to get a visual picture, really, of who is this person. When are they experienced investigator? Are they mid-career? Are they junior and they're just getting going? Have they just come out of a postdoc and there's no institutional commitment to them? Or have they just come out of a postdoc and there's a lot of institutional commitment and they look like really promising? Because ultimately your decision is about, is work going to be successful? Is it going to be productive? Is a person in the right place and had the right training and the right track record to make the work really shine? You know, is it really going to be good? And so you really have to know who's that person and how they've been set up. So I try to glean that from biosketches every time. And there's red flags that you can get from a biosketch. So I think one of the things you should take away is try to avoid those. So for instance, you know, someone has a long contribution to science. This could be negative, and yet it's all about like year 1 of my postdoc, year 2 of my postdoc, year 3, and then go on the publication list and there's 1 publication. Forget it. That's just not going to help. So I still rely on the actual publication list every time as well. I don't want to just hear stuff people are saying about themselves. I want to see every publication they've done every year so you can kind of get an idea of what they've done each year. So the real objective data. And then the personal statement is really key. You have to say why you're the best position to do this work. So the first section is the most important part, and the contribution to science, I'd say, it's lower down overall.
So I think from a training perspective, the best biosketches I've seen is that in their personal statement, they talk about what research they've done and why they're at this point in their career, but they also talk about what they want to learn and what the next direction they want to go. And who of their advisory committee is going to give them that skill set. Now, it also makes it really important that the matching biosketch advisory committee member, or at least their statement, mentor, training plan, or whatever, make a similar statement. But a successful one says, I don't have skills in XYZ, this is a training opportunity, and I've enlisted so-and-so who's going to help me get that skill set. And then you look at that person's biosketch, hopefully, and say they've got the background. They've got the publications to say that they can.
You know, the K applications, because they are training, you do have to admit your own limitation. If you don't admit that you have a need, then there's not a need for you to have a K. So you have to make that acknowledgement is that I'm really good at these things, but I need, additional expertise in this area, and that's what this is going to do.
Echo fellow panelists, the place, sort of like Lou was saying, the one place where you can tie all the sections and the contributions together is in this personal statement, and what your overall objective is, what your overall career objective is, what is your scientific objective, what you're really interested in, and what's your focus. And so that's personal statement really shines, allows you to shine. If you can do that well, it really sets the tone for the rest of your Biosketch. So, to me, this is one of the more important sections.
It sounds like, do all four of you agree that personal statement is the most important part of the Biosketch?
Yes.
Yeah.
Next to the
Well,
publication.
Yeah, publication.
Yeah.
The optional link is really not optional in your opinion.
No, but that's really where you can see the trajectory that if they're staying flat, they're moving up, they're going down. That's the one thing that I think the older Biosketches did much better, was allow you to see what the trajectory is. That's important when you're thinking about whether we're going to give this a 1 or a 2 or a 4 or a 5.
I think the personal statement is so important. Do you have any advice to the K-Clubbers in terms of if they get a Biosketch from a mentor or collaborator and it doesn't hit the mark? I know this is going to be individual, but should they just rewrite it and submit it without telling them? Should they ask them to rewrite it? Should they provide them with a draft, a strongly suggested edit? Or what is your opinion on that?
I would rewrite it without telling them.
That would be fraud if you rewrote it and didn't have the mentor read it before you submitted it. That would be scientific fraud.
But it would be reasonable to say, you looked over your Biosketch, and it'd be really great if you add these 3 lines to it.
Yep.
Write lines out, and I'll be happy to do it for you. You need to have their approval if you make that change. So if they let you do it, they say, that's fine, make that change, that's okay. But don't without their permission.
I think the other part of that, as seasoned grant writers have a Biosketch, and the thing that might hurt a trainee is they just grab the last one they wrote and put that in, and they might tweak the personal statement, but don't tweak their contributions to science to say they have the specific skill set that you need. Otherwise, it looks like a mismatch again. So make sure you take the time to read not only the personal statement, but look at their contributions to science. And is there a particular component that you thought they did well enough because it was really written for some other grant?
So to echo that, you're just going to rewrite your Biosketch for every grant now. The way this is done, you just do it for every grant. And so we all have folders with hundreds of Biosketches, one for every grant. That's just, you can pick and choose some of the sections, but you got to rewrite it.
You make it this new rule that for K grant, not every person who submits a Biosketch has to have a personal statement. Would you still advise to ensure every single person who submits a Biosketch has the personal statement?
That would seem to be sloppy grant preparation. You didn't make everyone on your team correctly.
I would why they were there.
Right.
So that their potential to help is lost.
Yeah. Again, coming back to the personal statement as a place to really put forward things that tie together the rest of your Biosketch. If your mentor is writing this, or hopefully he's going to talk about what his history is in terms of training and his dedication to training. That's where it fits in terms of like a K Award mentor's Biosketch. Somebody said to me the other day about putting together a bunch of Biosketches for a training grant that's going in at the graduate school level, and I was told not to put this personal statement in it. And I thought to myself, this seems like a mistake.
Yeah.
Because I think that this section, again, is really critical for hiding your role on this grant. And if it's a training grant or if it's a K Award, then you've got to be talking about mentoring.
And like Russ says, if you don't do that, then it comes across as if, oh, this was the last minute I threw my Biosketch in and I'm not really know the PI. It really gives a negative perception. So there has to be at least at the bottom of that personal statement, something that says, I'm excited to help with this project for Dr. X because, that sort of thing really makes you know that they actually thought about it.
I'll speculate on that graduate school training grant was the reason they probably did that, is that there were such inconsistencies of investigators. They'd have personal statements that were about something totally different. And so they probably get rid of all of them, which is not the right thing, but that's, why else would they have, because you'll just send in their most recent one, and if it doesn't talk about the right thing.
Yeah, and since they don't have it
Out
anymore.
of place, yeah.
Speaking of sloppy grantsmanship, there's a very specific rule that up to 4 citations can be included after the personal statement in each contribution. Yet, I think a lot of people put in more, at least in my experience. If there's more during review, do reviewers view that unfavorably, or is it not noticed typically?
I would say that 9 times out of 10, it's not a comment. There's a comment made about it.
But that helps.
If the grant is borderline, if you don't have a lot of enthusiasm about the grant to begin with, it's just, it's the fire.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think when I have a grant in front of me, it means program has let it go through their first administrative piece. So they claim they can reject an approach outright for not following the directions. But once you get assigned it, you're supposed to say, I'm reviewing it now. But they would say they can't follow directions. And that's good.
Yeah, it does hurt. I've had several where they use the old Biosketch, and you go, person's not top of it anymore. Why did they pick this person to be on their group? And I would say most reviewers don't, to their minds, they think 4 to 5 is the max. So if you're beyond that, they're going to think you didn't read the instructions. You're sloppy there, you're sloppy someplace else.
Right. Well, that was very helpful. I think unless there are other questions, we can move on to the contribution to science section. Anyone want to ask any last questions about the personal statement you didn't get answered? All right. So moving on to contribution to science, again, this is as a reminder about your research and your role in that research. Here's instructions, the official NIH instructions that you can describe up to 5 of your most significant contributions. You should indicate the historical background, the central findings, impact of this, and your specific role in the described work. Within each of these contributions, they should be relatively short, no more than half a page, including the citations, and they can cite up to 4 papers or the other research products. And now the URL must be to the federal government website, even though it's still optional. Here today, it's really not optional, and you can no longer use Google Scholar or something like that, so you will need to go into My Bibliography, or I guess there might be other government websites. So general suggested approach, and this is to group your papers by theme or subject in chronological order, and then you can kind of write that nice blurb about each of them. You want to give a short description of the relevant atmosphere, the state of literature before, your work, the role in your research, and now the impact. To make it really useful and coherent for the reviewer, I strongly suggest you look at this as an iterative process where you kind of get it all out there, you read it with a different hat on, read it from a reviewer's perspective, make sure many of your colleagues read it, have me read it. I think it's useful to get a lot of perspectives on this. One example from, again, Dr. Miller from last year. I like this one because, first of all, I like the heading on it. I always think that's really, really useful. He talks about the time period in his life during his postdoctoral training. You'll notice he doesn't show all 4 first author of publications, but he talks about what his role was during this time period and looking at these papers that were very influential in understanding the specific field of science. I'm going to show you is from Paul Spearman. And I think is really impressive, and I like the way it's written because, again, he uses that heading, which I think is really important, and then which is not part of the rules, but I strongly suggest that because I think it makes it reading a little bit easier, a lot easier. I like the fact that he talks about developing HIV vaccines, and despite more than 25 years of effort, we still lack this this vaccine, talking about, you know, they haven't solved it yet, but this is what they've been working on, and this is what they're doing to try to remedy that. I think it's really powerful. The appropriate number to list. I think that last year when we talked about this, Dr. Miller said if you're an assistant professor and have 5 contributions, congratulations, you're getting tenure any minute. So up here in this bullet, this is pulled from the instructions, and this is specifically not for assistant professors, but a little bit before, so trainees. They're urged to consider highlighting 2 to 3 they consider most significant. That kind of gives you a little bit of a guideline. But I'd like to turn over to the reviewers now and ask them, when you see an assistant professor with 5 or a full professor with 1 or 2, does that raise any red flags for you? Do you look at quality versus quantity?
So there's no absolute right answer, but I think you've got to be honest. You know, what are real contributions that you've made? So one thing you see commonly for junior PhD scientists is this is what I did during my graduate training, this is what I did during my postdoctoral work, and it's usually 2 somewhat different themes, and it makes sense, and they're both contributions, and that flies just fine, I think. I've also seen where if someone is a little further along, or they're a physician scientist, and they've done something a little bit differently, then, you know, if you've done some clinical investigation or run a novel program, that becomes a section. And then the science that is maybe more relevant to the current application is a separate or later development in the career. That all flows just fine as well. But you don't want to put 5 areas down if you have 1 publication and try to say, well, in the introduction I said this, and, you know, it's not quite that bad. But you see some that really are a stretch, and there's no reason for that. We keep in mind that all the reviewers are going to go pretty quickly, I think, through the contribution section. I read them. I don't put as much weight on that as I do on my own assessment, because someone can try to build themselves up, and it's pretty easy to see if it's fluff.
Follow-up question. So you said that for a clinician, it is okay with you if they put in a non-research contribution? Is that what I heard you say? Well,
it should be relevant to their career. If they're a nephrologist and they've been working in a particular area, to put a section about what they've been doing there, and now they're on a mouse model of cardiac disease, chronic lung or chronic kidney injury, that sort of makes sense, because it flows for that is their career. So I think it makes sense to do that. And that hopefully they've had some publications that go along with both those areas.
Yeah, point. I've seen some good, so for Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute review, I've seen some really good transitions for clinicians or physician scientists that I became interested in infectious diseases, and out of that grew an interest in viruses, so forth. And so here's my clinical practice, so that you knew the background from which they were working all tied together. So it's about your story as best you can still tell it. But I've also seen on the flip side where people have tried to talk about, well, here I gave a talk someplace and I gave an abstract, and you got to go, can't read instructions, bad sign.
Ways of looking at the contributions is, for those of you that have completed a PhD, is your dissertation was this body of work, and I would view the average dissertation would be a contribution to science. That's what it should have been.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it might be 2 papers, it might be 3, there might be a review in there. And as a postdoc, you know, you can link together a couple papers or something that make a contribution. But it's a good way to calibrate it. So if you're someone who's been out for 2 or 3 years, it's going to be very hard to have more than 2 or 3 contributions that have that sort of dissertation level contribution to it. The other thing as far as the citations is, if you have any sort of database or code that's been written, I certainly encourage you to get a digital object identifier by going to either like Dryad or these other places where you can get these registered sites where it's available on people. Because if you just say, oh, I wrote some code, and there's a programmer on it, they might want to see what it is. And if you have a DOI, they can click on it and actually see it there, and it's much more real than just saying I did something. Whereas you put it out for people to look at, it's a much more substantial contribution in that way.
I have a follow-up question on that. So when you're reviewing, if there is some kind of link in a Biosketch, a URL or something else, can you click it? And okay. I wasn't sure. In the instructions it says, like grants in general, you can't use web URLs, and readers aren't required to look at it.
Right, they're not required to,
but the behavior is that you do.
Yeah, but a DOI is a little bit different because that's how all of our publications are recognized.
Okay.
So they can use it to find it by just going into Google. Have to do it, but at least you give them a way that makes more sense than going to some obscure website to get some code from somewhere.
So to your point about the URLs, the one thing that I think as a reviewer would not go to somebody's website. That's the things that you don't use. I think the NIH actually encourages you to do that because that can be tracked. But as Gary, the DOI is great because you can look up anonymously and so forth. I would just make one comment about the contribution to science, not sort of a nuts and bolts format. And the paragraph in right that basically talks about the contribution should really match the list of publications that you put. And I tell you, I've seen this done very nicely and succinctly, and I mean very long, drawn out, half-page paragraphs in one contribution, one publication. So, again, don't oversell the important contribution. I think in the example that from Gary, he did it very nicely and very eloquently, and he said, I made a contribution as an investigator in this lab, and these publications, not my contribution, but these publications were very instrumental in the field. So he lets the publications talk for themselves, not necessarily his contribution.
Yes.
So I have a question about the inclusion of things that aren't yet published. So we were talking earlier about how you shouldn't include things that are in preparation. But the second sentence of what's on the screen up there is that you can include mention of research products under development, including manuscripts that have not yet been accepted. So what's sort of the happy medium fulfilling both of those sort of things? Because as a junior investigator, if you have something that's in preparation and you want them to know, then submitting a paper, but it's not published, you don't want to break the rules, but at the same time, how do you let them know about that in this contribution to science?
Right. My interpretation of this, and I would like other people's feedback, is that what you would do in a little intro read-in is you would say, I also have some very exciting data that you'll see in preliminary figures 1 and 2 that we're working on a manuscript right now, but you don't put names of the authors and the title of it. You just more conceptually say, we are working on this. And I think I don't think anyone would have a problem with that. I think it's more when you start making it look like a publication.
So it's not a citation, it's just
not a citation, it's just that we're working on a manuscript right now. It's we need more figures or something like that.
Yeah.
Just describe it in a narrative form, in a listing form.
I don't know how to ask this without giving my specific example, but I'll compare that for other people. In school, I did lower extremity anatomy work. Nothing to do with pediatric liver disease work that I do now, but I've kind of prepped it. This was my first experience in research. I produced 4 publications, presented at 2 national meetings, and it's difficult when I work with some other people, I've gotten different answers as to whether to include that. I think it's very acceptable. Tells who you are, and you have publications. It was it was research related. It all sounds fine.
Yeah, any evidence of productivity is great, and if you can put it in that context, like if I see someone that's producing and they've changed areas, as long as you can kind of make that connection, I view it as a definite positive.
Because you said you did it during residency, most people would say nothing, few publications come out, people are in residency. So if I accomplished this, and publications were a result, this person really worked hard. The fact that you changed fields is almost irrelevant at that point in time.
And that intro paragraph there, like you don't have to talk so much about how we learned about something about the lower extremity. It's more about what you learned about the scientific process and doing the clinical research. Like, and what you took out of it that context. And I think the reviewer would view that as, this is a productive person who is learning along the way.
Question?
The abstract, especially local conferences like us here locally, but a national, academic society abstract. So where we stand, unless instead of a properly published, clearly.
So some of your question, just for the people watching WebEx, is where do you draw the line in terms of kind of presentations? If it's a national conference versus like our pediatric research conference, that's this June.
So if a contribution, if this is part of about a particular contribution that maybe you're still making to science and you don't have a publication yet, and one of the things you list is that you did an abstract at hopefully a national meeting, the local ones wouldn't count quite as much, and they're kind of viewed as somewhat transient, kind of not the long-term product, right? But it could still help tell a story, maybe. It's just not weighted that heavily, I'd say.
And if it's a national meeting where they publish the proceedings or the abstracts are published, there's actually the name of a journal, even if it's an abstract. But sort of local, regional meetings, like the level of, it just keeps going down. I mean, even the abstracts for a national meeting aren't peer-reviewed, right? So it's a grain of salt. So if it's the only place you've talked about it, I would include something that was more local, but I include a local presentation of the same thing at the national.
Yeah.
Then you're just putting filler in. Just put the top presentation that you had.
The question that the conferences are relative to what? And you've touched upon this, like in terms of what your career stage is and things like that. But is there any discussions during reviews about, just for example, oh, geez, this person thinks this abstract that they presented at this regional meeting was super important, and I beg to differ. I mean, does that come into play? Do you really need to make sure that you've got quality behind your contribution?
From really ever hear discussion on the study section itself about biosketches, unless there's something really egregious or something. But as the panelists have said before, it's really about setting the tone. And as I'm reviewing this person and this application, setting the tone in my mind.
So it is bad.
You don't want to be the applicant that is considered delusional. We've all had trainees that think that their work is so great, and we can see right through that. So if you have something like that, that is a red flag.
Okay.
So again, I try to get a snapshot of who the person is and when and how productive they are, and that's what then sometimes gets discussed in the study sections is, where are they positioned? Are they positioned to succeed? Why was there a big gap or something? And so often, I've seen several biosketches where things like, I took a year and a half off as I had a child, and that sort of thing is actually in there, and it kind of gave me, okay, I think that sounds fine, That gives you an idea of what happened during a particular contribution to science period. So that was very informative.
So for people who really haven't ever been to a study section, how we talk about the investigators is really maybe a little nebulous, but the way it works is that each reviewer has a number of sections that we write in terms of our critiques. And one of the sections is the investigator and the investigative team. And as a reviewer is talking about or presenting his comments and ideas, there will usually be comments about the investigator, but really do we ever, as a committee or as a study section, comment specifically about investigators unless there's really a question mark. If it seems like it's all on the up, this person's qualified, it comes up during.
Except for case, right? It's all.
Well, except for case and career development.
Yeah.
Training grants. Spend a lot of time talking about biosketch.
And back to Jay's question, so this last bullet down here, is it useful to indicate context of importance? For example, this shows my ability to design and accomplish a research study, and it sounds like you're all in agreement that that's perfectly appropriate and helpful. I have a question about the one early on, one of the applicants said that they specifically gave a citation and said this was cited over 400 times. Do you think that that's a useful thing to do, or is that obnoxious? So a factor that sort of, do you see that often?
Within reason, it's okay. If you want to point out that it was a highly cited paper, it was important to the field, but don't do it as if, like, oh, this was on, this was featured in my local website, and or something that just sounds like you're trying to make it more glamorous than it is.
If it was like a highly cited article by ISI or something, I kind of, the thing with the number is that if you're like the middle author on a paper that was cited 400 times, I would be that impressed, but if it was your dissertation project and it was cited like that, I think that would be hard to do that because you're saying it's been very influential. It's one piece of evidence of that. I certainly tend to trust number of citations more than the impact factor of the journal that it's in, because you have some bad papers in high-impact journals and versa. So the idea of the citations is, a lot of people will include the citations and on their CVs and things normally, and it's abnormal to see that. But if you're going to talk about citations of your papers and you cherry pick one or two of them, versus if you're a person that just writes the number of citations, you just have to, again, don't be delusional in this. You want to be make sure it's an even-keeled approach.
That's a good take-home message, and I think that goes along with this one here, that, a lot of this came from Gary last time, that you really need to balance the humility and arrogance, and some people this comes very naturally to, and they easily talk about themselves in this way, and then other people have struggled with it. So you already said that people don't really talk about this during the review, but what about your own personal assessment and your own review before the study section? Does this play into it? I mean, you made the comment that you're always checking to make sure that their claims match the evidence. Does it alter your view of someone if they're either too humble or over their accomplishments?
Overstating is a negative.
And you pick up on that.
Yeah, I think you pick up on that. I think the under it is not going to hurt them. It just would be a missed opportunity.
Okay. The fourth thing I do want to talk about a little bit, because they do not give instructions that each contribution to science has to have a meaningful title, but I happen to think that it's super for when I review biosketches, it's helpful and easily helps orient the reviewer. Do you have strong thoughts on whether or not each contribution should have a title, and if so?
If you can't describe a contribution in 5 to 10 words, it's not a contribution.
Okay. You want it to be succinct and...
Yeah, it has. You're trying to say there was this done, and it should be. You should be able to do it.
Yeah. Remember, they're going to be looking at these relatively quickly. They want to see what your bullet points are for those contributions, and then they may read further.
So author names you have to agree with is a good strategy?
Yeah.
Yes. Formatting suggestions?
Make everything as easy as you can on the reviewers. So as a written study section, you may have anywhere from 9 to 12 grants that you review. And remember that there's a Biosketch for every co-investigator. So I literally have received grant applications that had 10 investigators, and that's 50 pages they have to look at, read, comprehend. So anything that makes it easier, such as title to a section, is what the time and effort invested.
And this is good too. Like I have the publications are indented and there's a space between each section. Like, don't cram things in here, because like I guess someone that won a Nobel Prize could probably list 3 contributions and you would be okay with it. Like the idea is you want to make strong statements that are backed up, but it's not about cramming text into a space.
Those also help show trajectory, and we're trying to make an assessment. I'm looking for a trajectory of where they were, where they are, where they will be. If you can succinctly tell what your trajectory is, then I know you have it well formed in your head. you cannot, and it rumbles, your grant's gonna look the same.
I think to that point, the person I spoke about who recently put in the grant application really liked the contribution because he could frame it that's most relevant to the RFA and really putting in the where I've been, where I am today, and then where I am, the precipice of where I am and what I've done in that area, and I'm ready to go to the next stage. So I guess we've kind of already touched upon this, but the one thing I want to ask is about if the publications link is missing, and I think we've heard a lot that it doesn't work sometimes. I mean, you're going to go and look it up anyway, it sounds like, right? So one of the take-home points I would say in my assessment today is you need to do that publication link, it's not special, and make sure it works.
And because we're going to look at it anyway, you want to keep your own because you're missed if you change institutions and other people have similar initials as you do. With a search, I may miss 4 or 5 of your publications because one time your middle initial was left out or something.
Right.
That's why you want to use your curated list so that what we're looking at is accurate.
That's on the downside of that. If I have to work as a reviewer, if it's late, short of time, and you make me work too hard for it, I say forget it.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Sound harsh, but you know.
We have about a minute left. These are a couple of other questions that I had that we can ask one or two, or if there, do we have any questions from the audience? Any questions about the new Biosketch as you're getting ready to write yours? Oh, yeah.
I'm a little bit further along, so I'm going to go more for the K to R transition, and sometimes you think the K to R transition funding is a little bit more difficult. You may have written all your issues related to K, you may have a foundation grant. But how do you deal with that gap, and you're trying to get an R, maybe you have a foundation grant, and you're looking at new areas. That's more about the personal statement, because I'm doing this, I don't have anything for this year, you know, to really write up, that's exciting. I'm doing something new that I apply for an R.
You may have to look at the individual Biosketch and the individual project to answer that correctly, but I think you'd want to see evidence that the K was productive, and you might want to have a section about what are you doing now that's going to be in the R if it's separable from the K. Or it might be more of a continuation and you have you not have a brand new direction. So we just have to look at how to frame that.
Yeah, the different parts of it, like how are they all contributing to that transition to independence? And each of them play into that. That would be very, very applicant specific, I think.
Yeah.
So join me in thanking our great panel for all the work today. Do you have any questions about Biosketches that didn't answer? Oh, yes, Barbara.
Guys, one more thing. I just got an email from somebody saying that they tried to go find the slides and everything, and the links were not working. You have to go to the new website, and there's a new place to go that says Take Love, it says slides, and videos.
Oh, okay.
So you'll